Okay, colleagues, it is 12 o'clock, and I think that given what we have lined up for us, and the fact that participants are dropping in plenty by the minute, which is very exciting, I think that we should start. Team, are we ready? Are you ready? Let's just see. I think that Russell said that he would come in at noon, so I am going to start. And it gives me great pleasure, everybody, to welcome you to this webinar, which is the launch of SPI's most recent policy brief, which has been developed from the paper, this SPI strategic paper on the economics of implementing universal basic income in South Africa, written and authored by Duma Gqubule earlier this year. So just to take us back to what we are seeking to do in the heart of this work, and a quote that I really like from President Nelson Mandela, very simply for me says it, and that is, quote, "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life." Since our inception at SPI almost 18 years ago, we have shown, I believe, a commitment to these principles and these values, and today is another such day and time and space for us. SPI is a feminist think tank that uses research and advocacy engagement to change thinking and demonstrate the value inherent in the simple things, like universal comprehensive social security. Globally, people's well-being and human security has become less, not more resilient with time. War aside, the promotion of democratic government should have heralded in better distribution of wealth and well-being, because one person's vote carries the same weight as the next. However, since the heyday of the welfare states, inequality has risen in all countries and between countries. And with inequality, the forging of elite compacts between economic and political interests, which reinforce the order of things in a seemingly impenetrable pact. Surplus feeds private and not public interests. Markets shape policies as profits are captured for the few. Progressive social security systems work and rest on a foundation that corrects market failures and ensures a regular circulation of income in economies and societies, the tax and transfer principle. This corrects inefficient accumulation of surplus idle wealth and can ensure that no person, no household, and no community lacks the basic currency to keep demand ticking over, demand for services, demand for produce goods, and demand for labor. With the demise of the foundations of socialized well-being and the rise of a neoliberal market-driven economics since the 1980s, there's been a constant pushback against universal coverage of basic guaranteed income in favor of means-tested, targeted, and conditional poverty alleviation programs. But as we know, programs for the poor are always poor programs. South Africa's social security system, the combination of high-end contributory private retirement funds, the exclusionary and inefficient contributory unemployment insurance fund, and the targeted low-value social assistance program all bear the hallmark of racial capitalist apartheid system. The system has not been designed to cover everybody, and in reality excludes the almost 12 million unemployed adults of working age in South Africa. The reluctant provision of the very minuscule social relief of distress is indicative of a national treasury at odds with the Department of Social Development, which itself has been promoting universal basic income for 2 decades. SPI, as a feminist social security think tank, has been at the forefront of policy advocacy on social security since our inception. Indeed, this is our 18th year, and we celebrate our coming of age, though we are sad that this may also be the last year of our existence. However, we continue to be proud of our innovative and excellent research and advocacy. Earlier this year, we launched the 2024 SPI strategy paper, The Economics of Implementing Universal Basic Income in South Africa, at an AIDC launch in February in 2024 in Cape Town. This was an update of an earlier position paper of SPI, both of which were authored by our associate Duma Gqubule. Noma Jakuja took this paper and added a comparative analysis of global spend on social security, which demonstrates that South Africa is not, despite the headline mainstream business media, overspending on social security. And in fact, there is much more space to spend on social security. This, in addition to the findings of Duma's strategy paper, that a decent, what we call a SPI UBI, can be 96% self-financed, for us clearly demonstrates that the solution to the inequities of poverty in South Africa can be addressed and structurally buried if we embrace the economic stimulus of a universal unconditional payment of 1,553 Rand to each person each month in South Africa, the UBI, the Universal Basic Income. So I'd like to extend great thanks to the main author, Duma Gqubule, to Noma Jakuja and colleagues, Matapelo, as well as Moses and Kamradine, and welcome to Moses' little son who was born last week. I'd also like to thank Russell Wilderman of UNICEF and Dominic Brown of AIDC, who are the respondents, both great friends of SPI. I'd like to thank ACTA, the former anti-apartheid movement in the UK, which is a great partner of SPI and contributed to supporting the writing of the paper. And I'd also like to extend a special welcome to David of ACTA, who's joining us today. We welcome friends and comrades from far afield as Brazil and India, Sweden, diplomats, as well as academics. And I'm very, very pleased in this webinar to be able to extend a welcome to so many comrades from community-based organizations and advice officers. And then just before I close, as part of the civil society advocacy at the spring meeting of the World Bank and IMF, this morning SPI sent a letter as part of the global campaign for social security to South Africa's ED at the World Bank, Ayanda Dlodlo, calling on her to ensure that the World Bank do 4 things, which is firstly to support states to realize the right to social security, to replace the focus on poverty targeting with universal systems, to support equitable and sustainable public systems, and to cease harmful austerity budgeting reforms. We hope that tomorrow evening you'll be able to join SPI as I talk on a platform hosted by the Global Campaign for Social Protection Floor, which sadly is at 10 o'clock in the evening, which is Washington time. But I think that's just indicative of how, for us at SPI, the struggle certainly continues. And we are very, very grateful that you've given us these 2 hours to be part of the research, the thinking, the arguments, the building of the case. We encourage you to follow SPI on all our social media platforms, and as well as to like this. So at this point in time, well done. And also I'm now going to move to the program, which you should have received with the link. Just to say, having started on time at noon, I will be followed by the main presentation by Noma Gqubule, and our 2 respondents, Russell and Dominic, will follow, which takes us up to 1:15, and that will then be a very broad and open floor for questions, comments, ideas, thoughts, and participants are encouraged to note your question in the chat. Those will be curated by Kamradine as well as Matapelo, and then also, of course, from the floor. So welcome, and I'm now just going to briefly introduce you to the three participants before I hand over to Noma Gqubule. So Noma Gqubule is our very own head of research at SPI. She's worked on a variety of public policy programs, including developing a financial inclusion strategy for a leading African bank in 12 markets, and the SADC Secretariat, the climate change mitigation strategies in South Africa, and the United Nations Sustainable Food Systems Programme. Noma has worked as economic researcher and policy manager for the South African Federation of Trade Unions and has consulted for the World Bank. Her most recent work was developing a gender mainstreaming policy for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and she was named Mail and Guardian's leading woman in governance in South Africa in 2019. Noma is a member of the International Association for Feminist Economists, and as I said, our very own senior researcher at SPI. So welcome and thank you, Noma. And then just very briefly, Russell Wilderman heads up the social policy at UNICEF in South Africa. Russell has more than 20 years of active experience in the development field, and his main interests are public finance, as well as quantitative education and poverty programs at IDASA, South Africa. And poverty studies. Prior to joining UNICEF South Africa, Russell worked as the head of economic governance program at IDASA in South Africa and did extensive cross-country work in East, Southern and West Africa on applied budget work, school financing modalities in developing countries, and small-scale farming and governance and social accountability. Russell has worked alongside SPI for many years, going back to our socioeconomic rights monitoring, where he did the analysis for our education program, and has taught many successive SPIs on budget advocacy and how to read and understand. Thank you very much, Russell. I know you're on leave, so it's deeply appreciated. And our second respondent is Dominic Brown, who's the Economic Justice Coordinator at the AIDC. He is a socioeconomic and environmental justice activist. Dom has undertaken and written research utilizing a political economic methodology and conducts popular education and training for social movements and trade union formations. And Dominic as well has also contributed to many hours of SPI engagements and also coalition work. So thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoy this as much as I intend to. Thanks, Noma.
Thank you, Isabel. Good afternoon, everyone. Confirming, can everyone see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Thanks, Moses. As Isabel mentioned, my name is Noma Jakuja, the head of research at SPI. And the policy brief will focus on a paper that was written by Duma, which is titled The Economics of Implementing a Universal Basic Income for South Africa. And then I'll just give a quick background of the research unit and what SPI stands for as an organization. We work across 4 pillars, which is strategic information gap identification. And then we also take that into quality research, whether it's undertaken or assessed. We turn that and produce it into communication key messages, such as the policy brief and the webinar today. We also use various forms of media to communicate, both print, social media, radio, and TV, as well as using currently with the support of UNICEF, going into movie productions and video productions and animations, just to make our research more digestible to a wider audience. We are also part of collaborative spaces, working with stakeholders and other networks, such as the International Social Security Network, as well as South Africa's UBI Coalition. And what SPI seeks to do is to have an informed and motivated policymaker. We seek to raise public awareness, as well as agreement and understanding within civic and public spaces. And our overall impact is to reduce poverty and inequality in South Africa. We work across 4 thematic areas, predominantly social security, universal basic income grant, which is where the webinar and the policy brief today is housed. We also work across a decent standard of living, and as well as recently added last year, just transition and women. I'd like to start off by this quote, which says, "Economic history is a survey course designed to stimulate further your curiosity by providing glimpses of some of the pivotal events in the history of economics, and sketches great figures who have significantly affected the economy and thereby shaping the world we see today." And today's policy brief will look at 2 pivotal events in South Africa, well, in global history, which is the 2008 financial crisis, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll start off by just sharing some key messages that came out from the policy brief. And number one is that a universal basic income for SPI is not just a welfare, but it actually can be used as an economic stimulus to kickstart South Africa's economy, which for the past 10 years has not been growing above 4% in terms of its GDP. And then also the country's high unemployment rates, especially among its young Black women, places the country on a very unsustainable trajectory. The nation of young women, which is basically Black women that are disproportionately affected by stale and low economic growth, as well as inequality and unemployment rates. The policy brief calls for, and SPI in general, calls for a UBI to the value of 656.9 billion to be implemented over a period of 3 years. And this is not the only policy that South Africa should embark on in trying to revitalize the economy, but it's one of 7 pillars of fundamental reforms that are needed to get our country going on the right track. And the Social Policy Initiative UBI, as Isabel mentioned earlier on, has a 96% self-financing component. The universal basic income needs to be at a macro level, both in size and in composition. So why a universal basic income? As mentioned, South Africa for the past 30 years, as we celebrate our 30 years of democracy this year with heading up to the elections in May, we are sitting at 41.1% unemployment rate. South Africa also has a GINI coefficient of 0.61, making it the highest unequal economy in the world. According to the World Economic Forum, that measures the inclusiveness of communities and economies, South Africa has a score that's below, that's sitting at 52.9, which is below upper middle income economies with a score of 54.8, meaning that our country is not inclusive. And some of the measures that go into that index include location, race, gender, age, and as well as parental status, especially looking at first generation parental status. And all of those you'll find in the policy brief. And again, still asking the question, why a universal basic income? There is need for multiple policies to address South Africa's multiple dimensions of poverty and unemployment. A UBI is part of a broader and a slew of policy interventions that SPI is calling for and that are actually needed to get our economy going. But it's also an important policy in and of itself. And the size of the UBI matters. It needs to be big enough to kickstart economic activity. The composition of a UBI also plays a role in making it more effective. Currently, under the current macroeconomic policy of austerity, which is pushing less spending on governments, a UBI is not feasible. South Africa needs to pursue an expansionary macroeconomic policy as it did between 2003 and 2008 under the GEAR program. And often we get told by our policymakers that South Africa is already spending a lot. And this is where the policy brief came in to do a desktop literature review and data analysis, and specifically focusing how much South Africa spent during the fiscal crisis of 2008 to get over it, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. Why we particularly chose crisis period is because South Africa's high unemployment levels for SPI constitute an economic crisis. So we use data from COVID-19 to compare South Africa to a number of countries. I excluded in these measures guarantees, public loans, financial bank bailouts, and central bank measures, which is monetary supply side like QE. I also excluded the acquisition of loans and securities. I mainly focused on spend that was stated, which is the announced discretionary measures by the countries in the study. And I defined social security to assess how much of that spend went into social security. I defined it as any policy intervention that seeks to reduce poverty and vulnerability induced by an economic shock. And this is the data that was extrapolated using a number of sources, the IMF, the World Bank, as well as the UN tracker. And you will see, starting from looking at this graph, starting from 2008, I compared South Africa to the United States, China, Japan, and Russia. Russia for the BRIC and upper middle income comparative analysis. And then I also just focused on developed countries, because one would think that developed countries would spend less on social security, but as evident in this graph, that's not the case. And that is the total size in blue, the total size of the stimulus announced by each country. In 2008, we see South Africa coming in at 9.9 billion, where the US announced 7.787 billion. And then we had China at 585 billion. And then the line on top running parallel in green, that is the stimulus as a percentage of GDP, which is also important to note. And then the sort of red maroon color, that's the proportion of that spend that went into social security. And in South Africa, that amount is 5.52 billion, which is nearly half of the announced package. But at the same time, compared to other countries that were spending 1782, 134, looking at China, and in the US looking at 310 billion, that's not a very high amount. And also just looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, but this is data that's taken from 2020. You can see the size and the volume of the stimulus packages announced, and the US coming in #1 again, and comparing to South Africa only spending 3.1 of that announced packages on social security, and only having a total announced stimulus package of only 16.7 billion, which is well below the amount of a UBI that we even needed. And we also stated that the UBI would be one of 7 pillars needed. And by this information, this seeks to just highlight that the notion that South Africa is spending a lot is relative, and it's not the truth. And even from that total expenditure that was announced in 2020 of 16.7 billion, only 3.1 went into social security components. The rest of it went into business support and various other activities in the economy. And one doesn't even need to, if you just even look at the ratio between those two numbers, South Africa can definitely still spend a lot on the social security component. So where will the money come from? That's another question that we often asked a lot, and we try to answer in both Duma's paper and the policy brief. Again, I reinforce that SPY is asking for a 656.9 billion that has a 96% self-financing component. And some of the financing mechanisms that are contained and proposed by SPY include quantitative easing, increased borrowing, the restructuring of South Africa's assets, including the PIC, as well as the use of excess foreign reserves by the Reserve Bank, as well as the institution and implementation of taxes, but obviously focusing on non-regressive taxes. And that's the end of my presentation. I'll now hand over to the respondents.
Thank you very much, Noma Gqubule, for that. And that was really succinct and brief. I look forward to us being able to spend unusually amount of time in the question and answers. Russell, are you able to come and give your response to Noma Gqubule's input, please? I've also, as we bring Russell on board, I've also been asked to remind people to please put questions into the chat. And I also recognize the chair of our board, Comrade Susan Jikalana. Thank you, and over to you, Russell. Noma, can you put your camera off? I think there we go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you, Noma, for that wonderful presentation. I hope I'm audible. I can be heard clearly.
Yes, you are.
Okay, great stuff. Just a couple of qualifications before I actually start and just give a broad perspective on what was delivered. Within the United Nations, we're obviously still discussing what position to take on the universal basic income or, universal basic income support, whatever you want to call it. And so I'm not going to say something about the size, when it should be done, et cetera, because that would be to sort of, run ahead of my organization in terms of the way that it likes to see, how this, how whole debate plays out. And then secondly, with reservation, I would have wanted to actually read the original paper. I requested the original paper, but unfortunately, I just didn't have time. And so I relied exclusively on the policy brief that was developed by Noma, which is really well laid out, and the messages are fairly
Russell, it seems that your Wi-Fi might be sticking. You're stuck in your presentation. Perhaps you'd like to turn your camera off and see if that assists. I will call you.
I apologize. I think it was an internet connection that sort of Yeah, it was an internet connection that basically sort of, got me there. But just briefly, I'll just make a couple of points because I think there's broad agreement among all of us here that some intervention is needed to deal with the inequality, with the poverty, with hunger, which is a big issue in this country. And so therefore, there's no principled objection to the idea that some intervention needs to take place, to make this happen. When I go back to the policy brief and by extension, the paper, it appears to be directed at opponents of the universal basic income argument. In other words, the underlying rationale for producing a paper like this is to answer questions, is to answer the evidence questions about what people say are things that we should not be doing. And so therefore the paper and the policy brief, I think, needs to be understood in that particular way. It's a technical response to difficult questions often raised by those who are opposed to some form of universal basic income intervention. And so that approach basically, I think, relies on two components. One is a modeling strategy, and the second one is an attempt to change the characterization of universal basic income, not so much as social assistance, but as a fiscal stimulus. In other words, not as a handout, if you want to use the conservative language, but as something that may dynamically contribute to improving the South African economy, improving the well-being of those who are recipients, and understanding this within an economic growth context, right? So on the modeling strategy, and as I said, I would dearly, absolutely love to read the original paper. And I apologize to Isabel and the team. It's just been such a hectic period. But on the modeling strategy itself, I think the idea of a fiscal multiplier is quite important. Now, if you were to look critically at the fiscal multiplier and the multiplier effect, you would basically ask one question, and this is the one question that I don't know if it's addressed in the original paper, but different kinds of studies have been done and they come up with different results. So for an external observer, it will be extremely important to understand why is it that in the modeling strategy of different economic modelers, they come to different conclusions. What's the reason for that? Is it the kinds of assumptions which are made, et cetera, et cetera? So there would have been, I think, an opportunity, an educative moment for those who are not macroeconomists to understand exactly how the modeling strategy is employed, what are the limitations of this particular strategy, are their results different than yours, and how are these results explained? The idea is not to use opposing evidence to eliminate the argument. The idea is to be educative and to actually teach us why you have different results. So, for example, why did the South African Reserve Bank in its study speak about almost like a zero multiplier effect? You know, what's going on? And I think it's important from an educational point of view for us to understand it. And I unfortunately didn't see it in the policy brief. It might have been addressed in the bigger paper. So it would be really interesting to just understand why do we confidently assume that there would be a 1.5% multiplier effect when some people are saying that effect is less than 1. The other thing which I think from the modeling strategy point of view, which perhaps needs to be considered, would be what economists call offsetting behaviors. In other words, in response to an official policy position to introduce a universal basic income, what are some of the expected offsetting behaviors by, say, the political elite, the economic elite, private capital, middle-class households, upper middle-class households, et cetera, et cetera? You know, it's this idea that if you think that you're going to have to pay significantly more, let's say taxes, for example, this may lead, for example, you to actually spend less and therefore have an impact on the extent to which the economy is able to grow. And the question would be, and the observation would be, have there been any considerations of offsetting behaviors, in particular within the South African context where you have a very conservative mindset? You have, for now, you seem to have broad cross-political agreement on the necessity of social assistance. There's less agreement on the aggressive expansion of the social assistance system. And it's almost like the political elite have framed the existing social assistance system is where we need to be, and alongside that, we need to grow the economy. So I would have wanted to hear a little bit more about whether the modeling strategy actually includes any offsetting behavior. In other words, from a behavioral point of view. Now, on changing the characterization of the universal basic income or basic income support from social assistance to a fiscal stimulus, I think that's a bold move. But I think it will be hard to sell because of the rigid and the rigidified understanding of private consumption expenditure and productive investments. I think it will take more time to win that argument and to make the point that this is not about redistribution. This is not about inequality, although it may have inequality effects and redistributive effects, as Noma's policy brief actually indicate. But I don't know if the switch from calling it a social assistance intervention, a social security intervention, to something like a fiscal stimulus will necessarily fly, in particular within this kind of constrictive, narrow, neoliberal kind of context. And then the second point is, and which potentially is an area that needs to be looked at, fiscal stimulus tends to be targeted, tends to be restricted to a particular period, but what you're talking about is a permanent intervention. I think this is irrespective of whether the intervention pays for itself or not. That point is well taken. But if you're going to call it a fiscal stimulus, but it's going to be permanent, then I think there's going to be some conceptual and philosophical discussions about exactly what you mean by that. So maybe there will be, in my humble opinion, in my humble observations, there might be some issues around redubbing it as a fiscal stimulus as opposed to simply seeing it as as an important social assistance, because I understand why that would be done. Because if you make it a social assistance intervention, then people will again use the sort of normal language of dependency and handouts, and they will characterize or think and imagine in their head all these millions of people going to get all these things, etc., versus the productive side of the economy. And whereas your argument, and the argument I'm sure in the paper reverses that by saying if you put more money in the hands of ordinary South Africans, that will have a significant economic multiplier effect, etc. The other argument that I think that perhaps you need to look at, and again, I'm not a macro economist, but if you're saying that the universal basic income is self-financing, which is a great thing, but it still leaves our debt to GDP ratio at 77%, and this is going to be long term, and there's unlikely to be a change in the GDP to debt ratio. You know, how would an ordinary person look at that? Does it mean that the flexibility of the government to respond to different initiatives are framed? Does it take away the flexibility of us to do different things at different time, depending on the presenting or the new emerging circumstances or the new emerging conditions? In as much as I understand, European countries and particular the developed world have much higher GDP ratios, debt to GDP ratios. They also have the power of reserve currencies. Basically, they're practically in charge of the global financial architecture. And South Africa is a small open economy. You know, how best do we see this? How best do we protect ourselves if, when in fact this is realized, we will have close to 80% a debt to GDP ratio of close to 80% of GDP, and indefinitely, is that the kind of outcome that we need to look for in South Africa? I'm just worried about our ability to respond to emerging crises, whether it's climate change, whether it's all sorts of other issues, etc. Then the other thing is, as I started off, I said the policy brief in the paper to some extent.
Thanks, Russell.
Yes, can be read as a technical response to opponents of the universal basic income argument. Now, I think what's missing perhaps is a political economy analysis of how you get this argument over the line, how you get people to accept that without universal basic income support, in what form, one way or the other, you are literally letting millions of people go through a level of misery which is incommensurate with a so-called developed democracy. And so in the desire to respond and present the technical argument, I think the political economy argument about what do we do next? What institutions do we need to tackle? Where will the battle be won? Because if you look at the existing environment is so ossified. You look at the position of South African Reserve Bank, National Treasury, you look at the South African government, you look at the mainstream political discourse, etc. Where would the receptiveness and the acceptability for these kinds of proposals be made? And how can we actually do the hard work to improve the acceptability of these proposals? And so for me, the broader political economy, I think, is lacking, and hopefully something which can be looked at, because it's unlikely that these proposals will be adopted in its present form, because, as I said, it's a technical response to opponents who would like to argue that this thing cannot be financed, or it's not sustainable, or it's going to take the economy down. And in that regard, I think it's doing extremely well. And well done to Duma and to Noma for taking this further. Just the last point, Isabel, you said 3 minutes or 2 minutes? Is my time up?
1 minute now, yes.
Oh, 1 minute. So I would like to to maybe just say, let's read this particular report with the one that we had commissioned, the ILO, the experts panel. The expert panel comes out very unequivocally that we need universal basic income support. I think the debate is no longer whether we need it or not. I mean, it's what they were cautioning is maybe to have a phased approach, et cetera, and so that you build the necessary understanding among different political and economic constituencies about the necessity of this kind of intervention. So I hope that, in spite of the sort of critical comments that this is not saying that we don't need it, but there are a couple of things that we need to look at in order to improve the acceptability of these proposals, in particular around the political economy. Let me stop there, Isabel, before I get chased out of this room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Russell, for that. And thank you for not disappointing in terms of the integrity of being a respondent. I mean, that's exactly what we want, and that's what the aim of having these webinars is. We've just been having a closed-off discussion, and what I've said to Noma Gqubule is that because there'll be a number of, Dominic's going to respond, and then we'll have questions and answers. Noma Gqubule will be given the last sort of 5 to 7 minutes, and she'll respond, Russell, to some of the aspects that you raised as well. But right now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Dominic, whom I'm assuming is in the Western Cape, but welcome and thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you to SPI Noma Gqubule for having this discussion. I think, Russell, you made some very important points, not least your penultimate one, of which I'd like to touch on some of them in the remarks that I will make. In the first instance, I think, and it almost circles or highlights the point that Russell makes, and that is that the issue of expanded social protection and the struggle for a basic income grant has been on the agenda in South Africa for a long time, dating at least back to, I think, the 1998 or the 1997 white paper on expanded social security, and then raised at the COSATU Jobs Summit, or the Presidential Jobs Summit, in 1998. And so it's a long-standing issue, which many people support, yet it fails to materialize itself. Nevertheless, I think I would like to acknowledge SPI's long-standing contribution to the struggle, and being amongst the first, including particularly Isabel for that matter, to champion a struggle for a basic income grant. And I think for many of us, we recognize, especially post-COVID-19, it's an idea whose time has come. Not least, I think, in a South African context where you have this problem of deep inequalities, coupled or driven by huge levels, or the majority of people, I should say, living below the upper bound poverty level. And in that regard, I think the proposal of SPI to pin the universal basic income grant to the upper bound poverty level is an important contribution. And I think we can see the impact of this in the lived reality of people. As AIDC, we see the example of Bongeka Busa, a woman who killed her children and committed suicide due to extreme poverty, as indicative of a much bigger problem, illustrated by this deep levels of poverty. And so I think that, as Russell correctly says, SPY makes another important contribution in this regard to show how technically a universal basic income is possible, whilst posing the question, how do we get there? The second point I want to make is also to agree of the importance of SPY's contribution and of Duma's, in that the role of the universal basic income is impotent if it's not in conjunction with a fiscal stimulus, and I would argue a broader expansionary macroeconomic framework, which I think the document makes itself, but particularly with investments into infrastructure and a massive prioritization of expanding the public sector. Here, I think post-apartheid, instead of doing this, we've seen the opposite, where we've seen declining levels of spending, gross capital formation in the public sector on the whole over the past 30 years, and in spending in general, which underpins in a big way the deindustrialization of the South African economy, contributing to the worsening levels of unemployment over the past 30 years. This, if it's not done like this, I think it's possible to see a tokenistic expansion of the SRD on a permanent basis. However, this will be seen with the increased liberalization of the South African economy, where we see growing privatization of energy, transport, and other services, and the entrenchment of the full cost recovery model, with the expectation that end users must pay. If we see the implementation of a permanent SRD, even as the level of around the food poverty line, this would in fact potentially deepen inequalities if this is continued with the current economic trajectory. This can, for example, be seen quite specifically in relation to energy, and a deepening of energy poverty, in light of the increased role of private sector generation of energy in the South African energy market, which would ultimately entrench and accelerate the Eskom death spiral with falling sales volumes, leading to the inevitable rising tariffs to compensate for the declining sales volumes and rising direct costs related to the processes of unbundling. This leads me to my third point, which is that the basic income, or the universal basic income, as SPY argues, we agree, needs to be coupled with the expansion of the public sector and the increased creation of public sector employment through an improved expanded public works program that is pegged at a living wage and that allows for decent permanent jobs that contributes to the improved standards of living. All of this, of course, underpins a different conception of the economy, and it's undergirded by the prioritization of the creation of sufficient demand within the local economy. This is a completely different assumption to which the current treasury and the general hegemonic economic policies are underpinned by, which in a way leads to a range of questions which in a sense connects to some of those that Russell raises, including that of the multiplier effect, and so on. So what this leads me to is that National Treasury's assumptions rests on an export-led growth model, which requires capital inflows to facilitate and offset the current account deficit in the balance of payments in an instance when you don't have a trade surplus or due to large levels of capital outflows. Now, in National Treasury's assumptions and leading to their estimations on the potential multiplier, their assumptions is based on broader aggregate demand from export-led growth, which in a way undermines the possibilities of the creation of local demand. Secondly, it doesn't allow for the creation of local industries that would create a bigger tax base, and in that way, the broader possibility for further multipliers. And so it's based on these different assumptions that it's possible to arise at different multiplier outcomes in relation to a different conception of how the economy would work. This too brings into the question of the resources. And I think seemingly there's broad agreement on the role of enhancing the progressivity of South Africa's tax framework. And in here, we think that there's additional possibilities beyond some of those in the research. Secondly, we think in agreement with the research that there is possibilities of tapping into South Africa's balance sheet, including greater domestic resource mobilization, like utilizing the assets under management of the Public Investment Corporation. But this has to be linked to a localization strategy that drives a reindustrialization program in the country that contributes to the creation of a large number of jobs. Now, this large asset base and potential for greater levels of resources mitigates against the possibilities of a growing debt to GDP ratio if it's used to improve the industrial and productive capacity of South Africa's economy. There are additional mitigating factors to South Africa's
2 minutes, Don.
Thank you. And that is that the largest share of South Africa's debt is in fact denominated in rands as opposed to foreign exchange. And secondly, there's also quite a lot of levels of foreign exchange reserves to cover import costs and debt service costs over the short to medium term. all of this, of course, would require large struggles from below, which is, I think, the real point that Russell makes, which is the major factor in all of this. And I mean, the Department of Social Development has, as indicated, been extremely positive and supportive of these proposals, but have argued that National Treasury has been a barrier. I think in closing, it's important for me to say that in terms of the overarching study, we have some questions about the possibility of the self-financing aspect of the universal basic income, especially at the proposed level, and the expected net costs. Given the socioeconomic character and nature of the South African economy. It's for this reason that AIDC has been quite supportive of movements like the Assembly of the Unemployed, who, in a way, along with the ILO recommendations and reports, have been proposing a phased-in approach towards universal basic income, prioritizing unemployed and precarious workers. But ultimately, it rests on the ability to create strong movements, I think, Russell. And I think this report perhaps can create more confidence in movements that it's possible to do so. Yeah. And once again, I think a big thanks to SPY for the report and to Duma and for the invitation.
Thank you very, very much, Dominic. I've just been told by Duma that the two of you have been on the radio for an hour talking about unemployment and jobs. So a double thank you. And again, thank you to Russell as well. I think in a way, Dominic was able to address some of your questions, but what I propose to do now is to just summarize some of the key points raised by the respondents and then to open for discussion. And I really encourage people not only to raise questions, but also to come in and answer. We're fortunate that Duma is here, and I'll also invite him after I've done an initial synopsis just to ask whether he has any points. Noma, please come in when at that stage if you'd like to, but also I will give you the benefit of wrapping up because I think there'll be a number of questions emerging from different perspectives and points. So we look forward to a really lively and constructive discussion. So Russell, thank you for your input, and yeah, from coming at it from your strength, which is from to an extent the sort of fiscal perspective, your question about the modelling and the using the opportunity to educate people on multiplier, I think that Dominic was able to talk to some extent about the diverse approaches in multiplier. Just to share with the audience that SPY has, together with DSD and Duma, embarked on a conversation with one of the authors of the University of Sao Paulo 48-country study into multipliers, and they'll be developing a multiplier on social security spend for us in South Africa as part of this project. So we'll certainly be having a follow-up webinar on that, on the ins and outs of that, as well as the implications, because it could certainly be a game changer when we look at GDP growth and the allocations at a national budget. But the multiplier argument is very important. And as you say, Russell, Treasury has got a very distinct approach, and that would be important. I like your point about the fact that you cannot have a permanent stimulus, and that is at the heart of the introduction, and why SPI doesn't argue for the phased-in approach that Alex's team under the ILO project necessarily subscribes to. But you have the stimulus, and then you have a secondary stimulus coming in through a massive job program, which is definitely in the paper, in the larger paper, which we can also have a further session on if you think that would be useful. Dominic spoke to a large degree about the question of debt, but just putting it out there for broader discussion, Russell's concern about while debt might be within a significant spectrum, how do you anticipate the impact of the vulnerability of unanticipated crises coming forward? And then, Russell, you drew to a close your positioning, your description, really, categorization of the paper as a technical response, and you closed off with a political economist question, and that's really where Dominic opened. He followed on from that, the history of UBI, Universal Basic Income, since before 2002, the 98 COSATU, the Presidential Job Summit position there, and his question, how do we get there? And he opened and pivoted back to that, the question of real struggles from below, and social movements. So I think that was really critical in terms of taking forward the knowledge and information. SPI's position has always been, as policy advocacy, to provide the data, and also at times the training for social movements, to arm social movements to take that discussion. So thank you to both of you for the time, for the effort, and as I said, for being constructively critical and pushing where we need to go further from this paper, and that really gives the wealth to the paper. In opening up, I've also just kept an eye on the chat. I think that, Noma, I would ask you to address Ntokozo and Reinhardt's questions. Ntokozo asks, with relation to the composition of the financing of the UBI, expanding on the restructuring of the PIC, if you would like to talk to that. Reinhardt asking about the comparison of financial interventions in different countries, and the financial intervention presented per person, if you feel, if you'd like to discuss that. And then Richard Kenburn's question about radical approaches to restructuring the economy, such as the Merck report in 1993, have attracted considerable opposition. And that really goes back to the political economy debate, and looking at the aggregated demand and restructuring of demand, the construction of demand. So that's a question which really ties into some of the respondents. And then Mbonisi asks, have you considered modelling UBI options with existing grants in the picture, plus thinking about the gender and child implications of potential trade-offs? Now, with regards to that, the SPI UBI is located on including the child support grant recipients into the general recipients. So it's basically all people until the old age pension comes in. So that would be the question of child. There would not be a potential trade-off in the SPI UBI. But I would now like to invite Duma, if you'd like to come in on any of those with the underlying paper, and then Noma, and then we open up for another round of questions. Thank you very much. Is anyone able to unmute Duma?
Okay, I will do that.
Cheers.
Hi. First of all, I just want to thank, can you guys hear me properly? Yeah.
Yes.
I just want to start by saying, congratulations for Noma on such a very good paper and a very crisp and to the point. She makes the argument very quickly. And I just want to thank also the respondents for very considered responses to this paper. Sometimes, respondents don't really add to what you're saying, but you guys really added to the debate, from different perspectives, And I just want to say a couple of points, starting with Dominique. I think, Dominique, I was really happy that you addressed what Russell was talking about, is that in South African civil society, we've come up with many proposals on addressing the SA Inc. balance sheet and how to reduce it. And we've also had at our conference in Cape Town, where the former budget director at Treasury, Michael Sachs, also gave support to that. I've been arguing with him for many years on this issue of the SA Inc. balance sheet. So there are many proposals that reduce the assets, in the SA Inc. balance sheet of about 4 trillion from the PIC and the foreign exchange reserves that that Dominique talks about, that wouldn't require an increase in debt, but the government does not want to. I mean, I think the arguments are getting really, how can I put it? I think they're more mainstream now than they were before, and we have to give ourselves credit in the sense that they are now using the UIF surplus for some kind of job creation scheme, and they used it during COVID and so forth. There was no increase in debt, 65 billion rand spent through that surplus at the UIF. No, it was like printing money that the government has in the surplus. That's the second. And then Dom's also traces the long history of this campaign. It's an idea that whose time has come. I just want to say quickly on that. That's so true. Because since COVID, as you all remember, we have had this unprecedented campaign, and we have to give ourselves credit for it. Big UBI is the most researched topic in South Africa since 1994. There have been a plethora of papers, more than 40 papers, by all organizations that have come up with different ways of addressing this issue of basic income grant. And I think the other thing is what Dominique is talking about that has come through now, is that it is sustainable within a broader macroeconomic framework, expansionary fiscal policies, infrastructure, expansion of the public sector itself, expansion of public employment, industrialization, and a living wage in terms of public employment. So the universal basic income is not a substitute for fundamental restructuring of the economy. It's just part of the restructuring, as Noma put it so crisply at the beginning. It is not a silver bullet to all our problems in South Africa. And now on Russell, the political economy analysis, over the past 25 years, I felt that there's been so much on this issue of the political economy analysis. We are just adding another building block to the debate, but the political economy arguments have been made. There's so many people throughout this campaign who've made excellent inputs on issues of dependency. I talk about Stephen Friedman, people who've made excellent inputs on the various facets of this debate. And I would like to say that this is just a building block to all the many arguments that are used in support of universal basic income. So this paper and the policy brief is by no means the last word on the issue. Dominic addressed the whole issue of the permanent stimulus, and Isabel also addressed it, because obviously the stimulus will fade, but other things are going to kick in with a broader expansionary macroeconomic policy framework. In terms of the multiplier, Treasury in the latest budget moved away from the negative multiplier. They released a paper on, it was an extreme position. And we wrote a paper earlier during the pandemic looking into it. And we concluded that there are offsetting things we can do as a country to offset the negative effects that happen, that may happen in terms, but some of them we dismissed out of hands. things like what economists call Ricardian equivalent. It was just so absurd that we didn't even think it requires a response. But then in the paper we did on multipliers, we explained how we can mute, or that's the word I used, mute the offsetting impacts of this stimulus they could have on the economy. And then finally, in the previous one, we did paper on the basic income grant. We did say that, you know, on the issue of reserve currency, I don't think it applies to South Africa in the sense that 90% of our debt is denominated in domestic currency, as Dominic points out. South Africa is not Sri Lanka. South Africa has a huge balance sheet, and if there is a capital outflight, capital outflow, there are policy tools that we can use to mute those impacts. Number one is, Dominic will be happy, he says that I never talk enough about capital control. I believe in capital controls. There's there's so many things that we can do to offset whatever is thrown at us from the outside world. And I repeat, you don't have to be a reserve currency to use your SA Inc. balance sheet. This is money that has been used in the last 2 years. And we also tapped into the foreign exchange reserve account, 150 billion rands. Nothing happened. Not even a peep that people talked about. You know, this is the last budget. So in the last 3 budgets, we have tapped into this, the ideas are getting acceptance. We have tapped into this SA Inc. Balance sheet. And what people didn't get, the last thing, is that the government has effectively created monopoly money and printed the money to, you know, the 150 billion rands. What we argue about in civil society is that the money should have been used to grow the economy and not pay debt. That's the difference we have in civil society. I think IIDC would agree with that, and many other organizations. So we agree with, so that's what I'm saying, that lastly is that we are not Sri Lanka, we're not Zambia. Thank you, Isabel. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Duma. Noma, I'm going to ask you to come in and respond to some of those questions, and also your initial reflections on the respondents. And I would like to encourage participants as well to keep on putting questions into the chat box. I initially thought it was a Q&A box, but apparently not everyone has access to that. So please keep them coming, and let's keep this conversation happening. Thank you very much for that, Duma, and thanks, Noma.
Thank you, Isabel. I think my first contribution will start at just addressing Russell's concern on pushing the debt to GDP ratio. Sorry, I won't project again, but I'll share in my presentation. But if you look at just the COVID-19 model and just the package where South Africa has a stimulus, it stated an announced stimulus of 16.6 billion, and only 3.1 went into social security. So that's an allocation question. That's not necessarily advocating for increased debt, but how you allocate what you have within the already existing purse, if one thinks about it that way. And then I think Dominic mentioned something that's very interesting, that UBI and any such policies must be localized, and they must also include a reindustrialization modeling of South Africa, where we just focus on localized good and production. And I think that's very important, because if you just look at the beneficiaries of the SRD grant and the UBI and where they're most likely to spend that money, it's going to be on food. And if South Africa is not producing its food at home via a localized industrial policy, what will subsequently happen, policies like a UBI will end up having the unintended consequences of pushing up the prices in the bonds market, which will lead to higher inflations and which can chip at subsequently what we're trying to do with the UBI, because if inflation goes up, then people are not going to be spending as much as we anticipate. So those are welcomed contributions and very important for SPI to consider and to include, I think, more explicitly in future papers. And just to answer Ndokozo's question, I think Duma touched on it a lot, but the idea of restructuring the PIC is that South Africa's assets, the PIC, the Reserve Bank, the foreign reserve banks have been over the years accumulating interest. And it also speaks to the borrowing component where instead of borrowing, you could actually use some of the interest earned from these assets to finance some of the UBI required finances as opposed to increased borrowing. And I think another question that was thrown at me was Reinhardt's question. So I like the fact that you included from your perspective as a public health person. And I'll start our personal, where we come from. I'm a macroeconomist. So my natural inclination would have been to look at a macro and do a macroeconomic analysis as opposed to a microeconomic analysis. But that said, this study can be done and compared at a household level. And that's probably, I don't know if SPI will have an appetite for that in the future, but it's something that can be done at a household level. I particularly chose to do it at a macro level for a number of reasons. Number one, UBI is pitched and posed as a macroeconomic policy. So just to support and buttress the facts, the points that we make there, it only made sense to look at it at a macro level. And that's, in a nutshell, that, including my biases of being a macroeconomic policy. But absolutely, the modeling can be done at a household level.
Thank you very much. I was just going through my notes, and Russell, you raised a question about the ease with which we would be able to change the approach on social security from it being more of an economic, well, from being a grant to being a stimulus. And I think it is helpful just for us to see how this is happening universally on different platforms, how the economics behind social security and UBI is really coming forward, trying to rescue the idea of social security from being charity and anti-poverty to having a much more mainstream driver of the economy. And it'd be interesting to hear some of your reflections, possibly the work that you do in other areas. But I see, there we go, that our chair, Comrade Sisa, has already asked whether you have examples of modelling strategy, and that has been promised to be shared. I think, Russell, if you are willing to share that paper, we can also just share it to respondents here. So in the interim around that, are there other questions, comments that people have, not necessarily linked now to the presentation, but just on UBI, on the questions of where the policies are going, why, in effect, we need to see a stimulus of demand. I mean, I think, having worked in the sector for many years and been part as a youngster, well, as a younger person, not a youngster, in 2002, with the release of the Taylor Report and the introduction of the concept of universal basic income, and how, although we say its time has come, we also see a variety of pushbacks from Treasury, also indicating that they don't see that there is demand on the ground. So I'm very keen to hear people's views on strategies around mobilizing. We've also seen that a variety of political parties have actually shunned the opportunity in their manifestos of really engaging at a much more phenomenal level on the questions of how they aim to reduce poverty. And in fact, there is an absence of scarcity and a paucity of ideas, which in a democracy where the majority of registered voters are living in dire poverty, the political promises seem to be aimed at a completely different population than the electorate. So as activists, how do we operate in that field? But having thrown that out, and I really look forward to some responses and reflections on that, I see Russell's hand, and I'm going to invite you to come in there. Thank you.
Can I cede the floor to Amahle, please, because I've already spoken, so I'll come a bit later as well. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So Cam, I think that you're down as Amahle.
Oh, apologies about. Please note David's question. Thank you.
Thank you. I had noted it and asked Duma if he'll respond to that. He said he'll respond to it sort of towards the end because that has a sort of historic referencing. So Russell, over to you again. Thank you for your deferring.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just to say thank you to Noma and to Duma for responding to some of the issues that I've raised and quite effectively. So, and also to Dominique, I think for just putting things into perspective. I like Duma's point about the growing acceptability of some of these alternatives. And I think that's the sort of thing that I was beginning to talk about when I was referring to the political economy. If some of these things are beginning to become more acceptable, for example, the foreign exchange reserve, the 150 billion, which was a proposal initially made by the Institute for Economic Justice. Although, in fact, as Duma said, the proposal didn't turn out the way because what they wanted to actually have was to push the money into social services, into the necessary things that we need to spend on instead of the savage cutting which is going on. But in fact, they've actually pushed the money into paying off debt. So sometimes a campaign can actually sort of produce unintended consequences. But given the fact that these things are becoming more acceptable and it's selectively integrated into the South African public finance system, maybe it then does require one to think more explicitly about how do you take this momentum, build on this momentum, and actually deliver, the decisive blow in terms of opening up these debates. And I think maybe a question maybe for Duma and yourself, Isabella, Noma, how do you think about these proposals in the context of after the elections? How do you assess the after elections environment, whether it's more receptive? Because I was asked in UNICEF to think broadly about what happens in terms of some of these other functions, for example. So I made a point that basic education is no longer seen as the spark plug to ignite the South African economy, and there's a thinking that social protection will in fact become the spark plug. And what does this deprioritization for education mean by definition? And interestingly enough, I was invited to a University of Stellenbosch a webinar where they were beginning to discuss education, basic education being in funding crises, and of course within the context of this push for social protection to become the spark. So maybe just a reflection on how you view the post-election environment. Is it more receptive to this kind of idea? Because I think that's all part of the political economy discussion. Thanks, Isabel. Back. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Russell. The point that you raise about post-election, I think, is really important. And we at SPI have been having some discussions with different departments in the government, not just about the medium-term development plan, but also looking at the South Africa's hosting of the G20 presidency next year. And we've been pushing from our side the approach, the embrace and consideration by South African government that universal social protection could be a theme that could become South Africa's legacy, as the current Brazilian presidency is working on zero hunger, and India and Indonesia beforehand. Indonesia had the idea of social protection as adaptation, which is something that SPI has also written a couple of papers on. But indeed, so looking at in the new administration, how does that work? I would like to ask Anthony, who is here from Department of Social Development. I haven't even tried him on WhatsApp to see whether he's prepared to take this question. So this really is making sure that government is on their toes. But in fact, Anthony, would you be prepared just to share some reflections from a policy perspective? I believe that Cabinet has now signed off on a green paper on comprehensive social security. Are there plans afoot for mainstreaming debates on more inclusive, universal and comprehensive social security that you can share with us? I think given that many of the participants are linked into broader structures, which link down to community-based organizations, if they are going to be inclusive process discussions going forward as green paper moves to white paper, would DSD be interested in having inclusive processes to gauge people's participation in that? If you are able to share with us, Anthony, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a special thanks to Noma and the presenters and the discussants for the insightful discussions this afternoon. And I think from a policy perspective, these kinds of discussions, the inputs by Duma, they also become very critical as we move ahead with the discussions around social security, social protection in the country. So the more we have these conversations, the better for inclusivity in policy making. So on the question that you are posing, Isobel, yes, government will obviously need to come up with inclusive processes as we discuss issues contained in the Comprehensive Social Security Reform Agenda, which is not new, by the way, in the country. So the subject that we are discussing now around the basic income grant, basic income support, it's something that we are aware, and some of the debates are about when do we implement and how should it be implemented. I think as a country, we have moved from a stage where we need to motivate for the reason why we need, for instance, income support and so forth, the issue of contributory measures that are contained in the discussions around comprehensive social security. So yes, Cabinet did give the go-ahead for further engagements with various stakeholders. So we will indeed call upon this collective to also be available at a time when those processes will be rolled out, because what we need is inclusivity in policy discussions as options are debated transparently and so forth. So the research that you are doing indeed is helpful for those in government and every other stakeholders. So for now, let me thank you for the opportunity to come in, although I wasn't expecting that you would call me to give a comment. Thank you so much. We do look forward for further engagements in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you for participating and attending. I think your support and participation in SPIE's processes is very greatly appreciated from our symposium, and linking back, of course, to our NEDLAC engagements. So I'm going to specifically ask Duma to come in and address David's question, and I think that we are doing extremely well for time. So if people do have final questions, please post them, and we'll curate them after this engagement. David asks, radical approaches to restructuring the South African economy, such as the Macroeconomic Research Group, the MOG report in 1993, have attracted considerable opposition and have been stopped. How do you intend to avoid this fate? So in a way, foreshadowing some of the subsequent discussions around the need for political interventions. But Duma, I think you are one of about 5 or 6 on this call who would be familiar with the contents of that research group deliberations. I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. You know, I must just mention one of the highlights of my career straight out of school was interviewing Vela Pillay, who was one of the authors of the Macroeconomic Research Group, and Ben Turok. Before Ben Turok passed away, he called me, I think a few weeks before he passed away, and he says, how does Business Day allow you to write these articles? And that's what I'm trying. So basically what I think is that we've come full circle to where we were during the mid-90s in terms of the economic debate. And what the Merg group basically argued was for an expansionary macroeconomic policy framework. It was a Keynesian framework. It was nothing more than that. And I just want to quote what the former economics editor of Business Day wrote, Greta Stein. She says, the Merg framework tackles the issue of affordability head on and concludes that an annual rise in government spending of 3.75% is sustainable, provided that there is economic growth and the real interest rates are reduced to 2%. Within this scenario, the debt to GDP ratio never reaches 60%. The Merg deserves to be taken seriously as an alternative to the government's normative economic model. That was the apartheid government's normative economic model that was accepted by the government in GEAR. So what I'm trying to say is that Merg argued for a public infrastructure-led recovery, and they modeled it within a Keynesian framework. And it's no different to what Dominic was saying earlier on about the broader context in which, so I just think that we've come full circle in terms of those debates. What we can learn, Isabel, is I don't think that the government is in a position to shut down those debates as they did in the mid-90s. And there is something that we should watch out for. The government wants to introduce a fiscal rule. And they want to lock in these, the Treasury wants to introduce a fiscal rule. They said they're going to have excessive debate on this fiscal rule, but what I'm hearing now is that the plan was to have a locked debate and then a law, but now they're trying to squeeze in a regulation which doesn't require a legal change. So I think that's the next major battle we'll fight. But I think Treasury, quite frankly, is not, I mean, I think we're smarter now in terms of how we respond to it. And I think, yeah, I think that it's not the same as it was in the 90s where we were on the defensive. But I do think that now things have changed. And yeah, I think Merg is no different from what is being argued now. Merg didn't talk about universal basic income, but they talked about many of the elements that we are talking about in civil society. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much. To some extent, there is possibly just some reflection on the last time that if Merg positions had been engaged with more fruitfully at that point in time, possibly we wouldn't be needing to have the same discussions now. But I would also like to draw attention to a subsequent question by Reinhardt, which to my reading actually comes in at a very different level from the macro. And that is asking, what role does economic democracy play in South Africa to create a responsive and sustainable economic system, referring to community wealth building and the control of economic enterprises by employees and community members? So looking at generating wealth and assets from a community level up, in addition to the conversations that we're having about the macroeconomic frameworks. I'm just going to open that question up. Do people have any engagement on Reinhardt's question? While people are thinking about that, I would actually like to ask you, Reinhardt, whether you've got examples of where this has played out, either in the UK or in different parts of the world that you're familiar with as part of the global universal basic income movement. So Reinhardt, I throw the question back to you. Not sure if Reinhardt is still with us, whether he has been unmuted. Okay, he has been free to speak. Reinhardt, are you able to respond to any examples that you can throw into the general discussion field. Okay, I don't see an unmute. Oh, there we go. No.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know an example from the UK called the Preston model. It's a city in the north of England where the council has deliberately taken a policy to encourage local people, community members to take control of economic enterprises and start new economic enterprises, and also ask larger companies to rather than to outsource or to get sort of services externally from large corporations, to get it from local community enterprises. And I mean, they obviously struggle. There is a reluctance among community members and workers to take control, I think because of the long history that they have been told that they are incapable of doing so, or because they are not used to this sort of approach. But at least Preston is trying to push ahead. And there are some other communities in the UK which have a similar approach, but Preston is probably the most well-known model. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To my ears, that really does sound like radical economic transformation. And I know that internally within Spires, we reflect on the changes that the restructuring of a universal unconditional basic income will have for communities, for towns, cities. That's certainly something which we need to be factoring in. If SPI is not a silver, if UBI is not a silver bullet, what are the alternative forms of development that progressive formations can be piloting and can be encouraging and teaching? So thank you very much for that, Reinhard. I think we are ahead of the clock, but I believe that there's been a very rich and dense discussion. Noma, I recognize your hand. I would just like to know if beyond Noma there is anybody who would like to add any additional closing thoughts, provocations, answers, or whether we can hand over to Noma Gqubule as she opened, so to close these discussions. Tam, are there any other questions that haven't been addressed?
I think we're good, Isabel.
Great. Then Noma Gqubule, can I invite you to wrap up the discussions and maybe highlight one or two areas that, from a provocative perspective, you think that we should be taking forward in the rest of our webinar series? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Isabel. Just a quick response to Reinhard's question. I think a month ago, I attended a presidential commission on climate change where they are tasked with doing community engagements, at least on the climate and the just transition perspective. And the pushback from communities has been precisely that they don't want sort of poverty strategies when it comes to community engagement and involving them in the just transition, but they really want the ownership part. For example, if a wind farm comes and it's implemented in the Eastern Cape, but how do communities become owners of those assets? And I think this is still very much a debate in South Africa where we still, despite our democracy, still going into communities with suggestive solutions that are actually not coming up from community as well. And this is some of the questions that has come up, at least in our coalition as UBI as well. How much are we getting community buy-in on UBI so that it doesn't come from a top-down approach, but they can house it and own it as the solution that they see is necessary themselves? And I think these are very, in an economic democracy like South Africa, these are things that are very important. And I think we're still very, I mean, I don't know any project. I mean, I also know in one of the pilots SPI tried to implement in Mpumalanga. That was also one of the challenge in at least our initial discussions with UN Women, how do we bring the entrepreneurial part into a UBI? How do we take people, maybe not even force, but add a condition that they become, they do more with the UBI, whether it's starting a business and, you know, but then that differs on a stance of an unconditional grant where you're telling people how to spend the money. So these are debates that are coming up in the discourse, and I think with time and also what Russell touched on what is the life of UBI after the elections. And right now we've been hinging very much on what a temporary grant that's currently in existence in South Africa, which is the SRD grant at 350. And the government has been smart in pushing it and extending it by a year just to cover the elections. But after a year, if the government withdraws that SRD grant, I think it's something we need to start thinking about. What will be the hook for UBI? What will be our way into policy to get it implemented? And I think these are all emerging questions. And I think while I'm answering the question and wrapping up at the same time, but this has been a very fruitful debate from our side. And I think from a SPI perspective, just even some of the thoughts that I raised right now would be interesting research pieces going forward. Yeah, and I'd like to hand it over to any of the participants or the floor that may have any last questions, last thoughts on the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very inclusive. Russell, Dominic, any final thoughts?
I think I'm covered, Isabel. I think this is a fantastic start. Look forward to the workshop on the multipliers itself and the sort of work that you are going to do in that regard. I think that will be decisive, I think, in this particular debate. It will also then be interesting to engage with some of these more conservative macroeconomists, for example, those who sit in South African Reserve Bank or the National Treasury, so that we don't just have the debate amongst ourselves, but we have it amongst a broader audience as well. That will really be interesting. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Russell, and absolutely. And we will also look to the UN and that platform to raise the debates in different areas and different levels of national, international, and global discussions. Dominic.
I couldn't have said it any better than Russell. So thanks, everyone.
So you won't. Okay, great. Thank you so much to the two of you. Thank you, Duma. Thank you, Noma Gqubule, Kamaradine, Matabello, Moses, and to all of you for participating. And we'll certainly, now that we've got your details captured, include you in the forthcoming debates and discussions. So go well, stay well.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.